Welcome, everybody, and good evening. We are so glad that you are here and that you have come to join us tonight for what we know is going to be a very engaging and important conversation. My name is the Reverend Catherine Duffy. I am the co-chair of the Creation Care and Environmental Justice Commission in the Episcopal Diocese of Southern Ohio, the group of Episcopal churches in the southern half of the state of Ohio. I will serve as your host for this evening in conversation with our guest, Heather McTeer Toney. I'm joined by my friend and colleague, Kyle Vath, who is also a member of our commission. He'll be responsible for both technological aspects of the evening and for taking in your questions for Heather. This event is the first of two this season in our diocese that are centered on environmental justice. In addition to tonight's conversation with Heather, we'll be hosting a lecture with Dr. Robert Bullard, who is seen as the father of the environmental justice movement. That event will take place on Wednesday, March 13th at 7 p.m. That is at Christ Church Cathedral in downtown Cincinnati. It is a free event and it's open to anybody. So we hope as many of you as able will take advantage of the chance to see Dr. Bullard speak. We do ask for an RSVP just so we know what to expect. And there is a link to that in the chat. For those of you who are joining us from Columbus, we'll also be hosting a watch party there at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church, which is on the OSU campus. For anybody who'd like to view the event live but can't drive to Cincinnati, please do join us at St. Stephen's in Columbus. I would like to say thank you to the Faith and Life Commission of the Episcopal Diocese in Southern Ohio. As a partial sponsor, their support has made this event possible, and we want to express our gratitude for helping us gather tonight with Heather. And before I turn the floor over to Heather, I do want to just note a couple of housekeeping details. We do encourage you to use the chat among yourselves, especially saying who you are, your name, where you're from, where your feet are on the ground tonight. If you're representing a specific organization, say that too. As far as questions for Heather, we ask you to use the Q&A feature, which you'll find down at the bottom of the Zoom window that you're looking at. Just click Q&A. You'll be able to type your question in there, and Kyle will be monitoring the Q&A. We won't be monitoring the chat for your questions. And the way this is going to work tonight is as soon as I stop talking, Heather will speak to us for 15 or 20 minutes or so, and then we'll turn immediately into questions. So again, feel free, you don't have to wait. If a question comes up, type it into the Q&A, and we will go through those questions and answer as many of them as we can in the time that we have with Heather. And you might notice that you can't turn on your video or your microphone. That is intentional. If anything needs clarification, we do have the ability to turn on your microphone and allow you to speak. But for the most part, we want to give Heather as much time as we can. And for that reason, we'll just be using the Q&A and the typed questions. So I believe that is all I have in the way of housekeeping tonight. And I am delighted to turn to the woman who is the reason that we have gathered here tonight, Heather McTeer Toney. Heather is the executive director of Bloomberg Philanthropy's Beyond Petrochemicals campaign. Her decades of leadership experience began at age 27, when she became the first African American, the first female, and the youngest person ever elected mayor of Greenville, Mississippi. Under her leadership, the city emerged from significant debt and focused on sustainable infrastructure repair. In 2014, she was appointed by President Barack Obama to serve as the regional administrator for the Environmental Protection Agency's Southeast region. Before joining Beyond Petrochemicals, McTeer Toney served in leadership roles at Mom's Clean Air Force and Environmental Defense Fund. In 2023, her book, which we'll be discussing tonight, Before the Streetlights Come On, Black America's Urgent Call for Climate Solutions, was published by Broadleaf Books. McTeer Toney has a bachelor's degree in sociology from Spelman College in Atlanta and a law degree from the Tulane University School of Law. We are very, very pleased to have you here, Heather. Thank you. Welcome. And the floor is yours, my friend.
Thank you so much. I so appreciate this. And first, let me just say I am so grateful to the Diocese of Southern Ohio for hosting this event and just having a conversation around environmental justice right now. In this moment, it is so critical for us to really have some deep and sometimes hard conversations and in the space of dealing with climate and the environment on this the last day of Black History Month, celebrated throughout the United States of America. I am honored to be here with you all, and thanks to each of you who've taken out the time in your evening to just join us for this conversation. I also smile with a bit of joy to see that the person who will also be speaking to you in Cincinnati is one of my instructors, one of my mentors, and I was honored that he was part of the writing of the foreword for my book. Dr. Bullard is a phenomenal individual, and I just so think you're going to be tremendously blessed for those who have the opportunity to share with him. It's a powerful movement and a powerful thing to be a part of. So let's just jump right in. And I have asked Reverend Duffy to help me out here and make sure that I stay on task. I come from a family of Pentecostal ministers, and I was raised in the South. So I come from that tradition of having three closings. And some of you all may know what I'm talking about when I say that. So I'm going to do my best to stay on target and on task and have a chance to answer some questions. But I think the meat of where we start is at the origin and the beginning, which is, why even have this conversation? Why write and talk about environment specifically with respect to African Americans and dig into this issue that has been cast as stereotypical, not important, one that has been greatly, I think, looked over when it comes to how the African American community engages in climate and the environment. And it's my own story. I was born and raised in Greenville, Mississippi. My parents came to Mississippi as part of the voters' rights movement in the late 60s, early 70s. And the plan for them was to come to Mount Bayou, Mississippi, and work for 2 years. Here we are. My parents have been married for 50 years. That gives you some indication of how much they fell in love with the Mississippi Delta, but also the level of work that had to be done. And it speaks to how social justice has been intertwined as a part of my life, my family's life, since I was born. But it was in that vein of working in and for communities that I found later through my life that the issues of environment and climate justice, environmental justice, and climate change were always around, but never impactful to people that looked like me that I saw. In fact, I said often, if you think about it and you just sort of Google what does an environmentalist look like, you see images that don't resonate and to me didn't look like me. I saw images of singularity, of um, of course, nature. But growing up as a Black kid in the Mississippi Delta, if you asked her, thought about what was an environmentalist or who was an environmentalist, I was like most other people. Environmentalists were white people who lived in the Northeast and were birders and were vegan and wore Birkenstocks and were more concerned about polar bears than people. My gosh, the amazement when in my own journey of working in community and as I worked to become mayor of Greenville, Mississippi, and served my community, it was through trying to get water issues, water infrastructure in my community that I came into the realization of environmental impacts and environmental justice. And it was with Lisa Jackson, who served as the head of the Environmental Protection Agency under President Obama. she visited me and basically said, you're doing environmental justice work, right? And that upset me. It upset me because for so long I had been in community and a part of people who their life ebbed and flowed around the environment. We knew how the Mississippi River would go up and down, the ebbs and flows of the river, not because we studied water movement, but because we knew when cousins and friends that lived in Chicago had big snow, that snow was going to come down river and we were going to end up with flooded fields. I could tell you when hunting season was. I could tell you when cotton was going to come up and bloom. I could tell you, and we all knew these really important factors of how our land integrated with what was happening around us, because these were the lived experiences of people who prayed, worked, went to school, all around the things that impacted us every single day. But we were never counted among the people who were considered environmentalists. And so throughout my career started as a public servant, but I was drawn into this work because there was such a big hole to fill that talked and would be inclusive of all people, particularly those who had lived in such close connection, had experienced trauma by, but also had so much to offer by talking about and thinking about how our environment is changing and the things that we need to do to protect it. So, my book and the way that I began writing my book starts with that question. It starts with, why in the world are Black folks talking about climate change? And why should Black people be concerned about climate change when there are so many other things that we have to worry about? Whether it's police brutality or equity in healthcare or disparate education, how is it that climate change rises to the level of awareness that we should be exceptionally concerned about what is taking place and the solutions that are being put forth and our role in that? And what I discovered is that climate and environment are all underlying factors to just about every social issue that we deal with today. So, whether we're dealing with healthcare and responding to pandemics like COVID or swine flu, for those of you who remember that, we can't separate that from the fact that as we see increased emissions into our atmosphere, increased industrialization, increased fossil fuel extraction, it has a direct relationship to the proximity of people and animal and spaces and our connections and how diseases are spread, particularly among overburdened populations. We can't talk about education and the lack thereof, in particular in some communities, without dealing with the real time impacts of toxic chemicals on communities of color and how that impacts how children learn or the infrastructure in which they sit, whether or not there are places that have something as common as air conditioning or heating, because those are things that will impact how a child learns, how they perform, and the test scores that they have to deal with. It is the understanding that there are cumulative impacts to all of us that relate to climate and our environment, how we sustain ourselves, and how we protect what we know and what matters most to us, which is our lives, our livelihoods, and our families. Establishing that for the future is so critical. And it's so critical for us to understand and learn from a diverse group of people. When I write about and I think about the role that African Americans have played in climate and environmental justice, I can't help but recognize that resolution and solution literally runs through my veins. As people who were taken from one ecosystem of plants and germs and animals and tragically moved across an ocean to then be placed in a different ecosystem that they were not familiar with. To have survived that, then be placed in a different ecosystem that they had to become accustomed to and then work in a very traumatic way with people from an entirely different ecosystem means that the folks who have survived that, and not only survived, but also thrived, literally have solution and resolution running through them. So it is incumbent as we think about long term solutions to the climate crisis, what we're experiencing, that we reach into those pockets of solution and begin to sort of peel apart what have been silos in the environmental community, but connect those dots to the things that have kept people alive and thriving. So it is how we talk about and sing about climate and environment, whether it is in a song of freedom, the way that the enslaved people utilize the understanding of how stars and rivers and pathways work to help each other reach a space of freedom, and they recognize the connection of nature in that, to the way that we have been recycling since our grandmothers, great grandmothers, and everybody else in our authentic line was able to take the scraps of what they were left with, recycle them into things that were useful for our sustainability, but also taught us the protection of keeping alive those things that mattered most to us. The creativity in our solutions, the innovation, all of these are lessons that can be brought to us today, but also used and shared in a way that has a global impact. So these are key places that I felt it was so important to not only put into a book and share, but also to help us learn. Because while I feel that I wrote two Black people, and African Americans are not one monolithic group, so we're not all the same, but we certainly do have some shared experiences. The book was written for everyone. And I say for everyone because there's so much that we can all learn from these experiences, and that is necessary for us to learn and share on a global scale. We live on one planet, one shared large global space that we call home. And the things and the lessons that we can take right now today are also lessons that we can share with our friends, neighbors, church members, colleagues, sisters, brothers that are in Europe, that are in Africa, that are in Asia and Australia, because they're dealing with the same challenges and same problems. All too often, I have talked with people who are simply trying to understand what is environmental justice in terms of the United States construct, and how is it similar to human rights issues that are taking place in different parts of the world, and what things do we need to learn together and implement globally that really put us on a path forward. It's the reason why at the end of every section in my book, I have a list of things to do. And I was raised in a community of thinking where a rising tide lifts all boats, meaning that nothing that you do is just for yourself. It is a collective community movement that means once one of us is thriving, all of us have the ability to thrive. So we all have something to do. There's activism in each of us. During the civil rights movement, there were certainly those who were on the front lines that we see in the documentaries that really fought and marched, and we can identify their pictures readily when we see them. But there are also those who were at home preparing lunches and sandwiches for those who were going out, who were taking care of kids and being the babysitter for the community while their parents were working and marching. There were those who were collecting fundraising and donations for bail money when need be. There were those who were just simply washing clothes and making sure that households continued to run. Everybody has a role that they can play in activism. And that is a lesson that I hope we carry with us today. The lesson to find that there is something you can do. There is some role of advocacy that you can play whether it is now being able to connect with the amazing social media tools that we have and share a story, identify what's happening in real time. I'm so proud of one of our resources that we pulled together at Beyond Petrochemicals. It's called Spill Tracker. And it's a lot of fun if you get a chance to go. I encourage you to go and take a look at it after this discussion that we're having tonight. But we launched Spill Tracker on the anniversary of the East Palestine train derailment. And Spill Tracker is a resource where you can go to a site and see the last time there was a chemical spill or fire in the United States of America. We found that this was profound information to share because in 2023, there was a chemical spill or a fire on an average of every 3 days in the United States. That means going through all communities, but particularly communities of color that are overburdened with toxic chemical pollution, with climate impacts, extreme weather, extreme heat, and the pressure of constantly having these things happen without the world understanding and knowing the impacts was devastating to the community. And so we discovered a way that we could help people and just show what's taking place. That's what those sections at the end of the book are designed to do. They're a simple 5 things that you can start with. It's not the totality, but just 5 places to start. Pique an interest and identify where you can find and see yourself, even in places with people who don't look like you. I think it's important for us to continue to have tough conversations, to think about the creativity of where we could show up, but also connect the dots of social issues that we are experiencing right now today that can trigger activism in every single community that we enter, whether it is the grocery store or your garage. There is environment and climate practices that we can pull from, we can identify with, and that we can certainly share with one another. I'm really excited that I got to write about it. I love what I do, and I would not have changed it for anything, wouldn't change it for anything, and look forward to talking about how we can engage in climate hope, climate innovation, and really see what the next generation of climate activists will be.
Thank you. That's really, oops, can you hear me? Yes, it's
Yeah.
wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Heather. I know I don't want to make the am I on mute mistake. So um
I do it at least once a day.
I know, and you would think after 4 years we would have figured it out, but so I invite all of you to put any questions into the chat. And I did not say this in the housekeeping. It is okay if you have not had a chance to finish the book. I know many of you have read it. If you haven't, that's all right. And you are here to learn, and maybe you'll be inspired by the conversation to go out and read it. But the questions in the conversation really is for everybody. One of the things that I appreciated about the book was the action items and also the definitions at the end of every chapter. I feel like I learned a little bit just by the time, I read the chapter, and then I learned even more by reading the definitions. One thing that really caused me to take pause and contemplate, you touched on it just a little, was the concept of green gentrification. And the reason I bring it up is because you mentioned starting action items and things that might continue. So I'm thinking of the stop, start, continue exercise. Green gentrification was a very interesting concept to me because it seems like something that we can put kind of a nice name on something that's actually harmful to communities with less resources, most of the time, or a lot of the time, being communities of color in our country. And how might we, number one, understand green gentrification and the ways that we participate in it, and then how might we stop participating in it and do something else? And then for those who maybe haven't got to that part in the book, if you wouldn't mind saying a little bit about what it actually is, that would help. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. And you think you're right. It's one of those things that it could be well-meaning and misinterpreted, and it could actually be harmful. So there's a section in the book that I wrote about redlining, which is a practice that took place in the United States, 30s, 40s, and 50s, legally through the US, where the US and insurance companies and banks would look at communities and outline them in red if they were communities of color. And it was a specific way to target a loan dollars away from communities where they could have impact, and again automatically put dollars into communities that were majority white and where they wanted to see economic prosperity. So let's fast forward to today, where we have an understanding of what gentrification is. Gentrification being the place in which you have communities, usually communities of color or poor communities, where people have been pushed out for a number of different reasons, very similar to redlining. And then the price and cost of the properties in those spaces are reduced, and people are able to come in and they take a community, for example, a poor community or a community of color, and then it is turned around and it becomes a white community. There are some examples of places where this has taken place. For example, in Atlanta, Georgia, around the 1996 Olympics, there was a lot of controversy around communities that were really moved out, and then they were gentrified. Green gentrification is doing that under a guise of climate. So, taking a poor community or taking a community that's along the coastlines, for example, in Florida, we've seen this particularly around Miami and Key West, where traditionally there are spaces that have been occupied by minority or indigenous communities, but because of sea level rise, because of climate change, the cost to rebuild in those places becomes too much for the people who have originally lived there. Hurricane Katrina, another example that we've seen and we know very well. So, what happens is people are forced to move out for cost reasons or for climate change reasons, but that does not keep the very rich from being able to come in and sort of self insure or take over those properties. So, banks and insurance companies, they sort of green or blue line areas where they will not loan money because there is a climate risk, but that doesn't keep others from coming in and taking over that same spot in that space. Um, it's interesting to think of and talk about green gentrification, because it can come across as, all right, this is a place where we know that people are going to be harmed or they're at risk, but it doesn't take into account the connection to land that people have. It makes an assumption that people are want to give up their land or give up what they have and has been in their communities for generations. We were in I was in South Louisiana last week in the St. James community, and then over in St. John the Baptist Parish. And it was a really special moment, because I was joining a group of people who were celebrating the Descendants Project, which is run by Doctors Joe and Joy Banner. They're twin sisters who come from the South Louisiana community. Their family comes from plantations, enslaved in property that is in South Louisiana. They're the first two Black women to own a plantation in South Louisiana. They just bought it. And they were celebrating this moment of restoration. But the special thing about this particular property is the Wilford Plantation is it was the site of the 1811 slave revolt, and it was the site of the first revolution of enslaved Africans in the United States. And for them to now have this space, as you can imagine, it's extremely meaningful for them. It is extraordinary not only to come full circle of this moment of now having ownership of a piece of property where there were relatives and ancestry that was enslaved, but also the site of a revolution against that practice. That property is a learning ground in a way that many of us can't even begin to fathom. And that's the intent for it. but it's also the place where they have to protect it against climate change. It's surrounded by petrochemical and toxic chemical companies. It is in the corridor that a lot of people unfortunately call Louisiana's Cancer Alley, an 83-mile stretch of waterway along the Mississippi River that's just inundated with facility after facility after facility. This is one of those only spots that is not touched by anything. And so the idea for them that a company or a group of people or a big multi-billion-dollar petrochemical facility will try anything to get that piece of property, that's where we see the role of green gentrification really rearing its really ugly head, but the necessity to be as protectful as possible. That's a site that right now is under the U.S. Historic Preservation and Trust. It's one of those sites that we're working heavily to make sure it's protected because it is so sacred, but because again, there are just some places that we need to make sure green gentrification does not take place. And despite the climate challenges that we continue to see coming through these areas, we must do all we can to protect and preserve what is there.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I have a million questions of my own that I could ask you, but people did not come to witness a conversation between the two of us. So let me turn to Kyle, who has been looking at the questions in our Q&A. Kyle, what do you have for us?
Yeah, why don't we start with the first question about asking you to expand on the title of your book?
Yeah, I love that. Before the streetlights come on. So in the Black community, especially in the Southeast, well, Southeast and Northeast, I have cousins there in Baltimore and Columbia. There was a time that you had to be in the house, and it was literally before the streetlights come on. That phrase is very common in the Black community because it is a call to action. It's actually a phrase that's a verb. When you hear before the streetlights come on, that means there's something for you to do. You must get to the inside of the house or wherever you're supposed to be before that light comes on. And it's a really powerful indicator because so many people within our communities know what that means. And when you say it, it means immediately action. It is a way of telling us that there's an urgency. When the street lights begin to come on, you should be well on your way inside to safety. If you are not, there are consequences. And so we didn't have watches. Even if you had a watch, that was not the indicator of time for anybody or anybody's mama. It was what was happening with that particular street light. And so when I talk about it, and especially if I'm in audiences of Black people, but I found this common. The more I've had these conversations, rural folks understand it really well too, um, because when you hear somebody yells, "Okay, the street light's about to come on," it's a call to action. For climate communities, it should be a call to action for us. And I titled the book like that because of the urgency of our collective response and the urgency of our need to listen and understand diverse communities. There's an urgency to doing that. If we do not do it within the time period that we know is set out right now, then there are consequences that we're all going to have to suffer together. And in my book, I talk about this a little bit more. I could, if I was outside with my brother and some friends and I just was inside the house, like I made it in on time and they didn't, I was still in trouble. Everybody was still in trouble. There was a collective, you are responsible. I am my brother's keeper. I'm also my neighbor's keeper and all the other kids and everybody else. So it didn't matter if everybody was not inside together, we all collectively were going to receive consequences. If we all are not collectively as a body of humanity addressing the climate crisis, none of us will be able to escape the consequences. So it is imperative that we work with one another, we listen to one another, and that we do this before streetlights come on.
Wonderful, thank you. Another question is, it says, I'm having a really hard time getting my church past the politics to address climate change. Do you have any suggestions to get clergy away from polarization?
Mm.
Talk Bible. Oh, it is full of so many different things. I think we get so tied up into the politics and the polarization of climate change. But I'm in Mississippi. I rarely say the words climate change, but I can talk climate all day. We can talk in our communities and understanding the language of communities and understanding the language of faith. For me in here, we can talk about how the seasons have changed, right? How where and how you see ducks coming through, and then what that shift means, how it's happened. I hear hunters talk about whether or not the snakes are in the deer stands, when and what's going on, and what that means. We've had shifts in weather here. It was 80 degrees yesterday. It's 35 degrees this morning. These are things and commonalities that we're seeing across all people and places. And the best place to talk about that is in church. Um, and I was sharing with I see we have I was sharing with Reverend Duffy earlier today, right before we came on. My two favorite translations of the New Testament. One is the First Nations version. I don't know if you can see this. It's the First Nations version. It's an indigenous translation of the New Testament. And then this one I just got. It's the New Testament for Gen Z. It is like the official Chat GPT interpretation. I love it, because when you look at different versions of scripture and you see and can expound upon the places where we see nature and we see climate talked about in scripture, it provides an avenue to talk about faith and climate change in a way that we cannot refute, especially for communities of faith and especially in conservative places, because there's a whole lot that people will readily talk against. But when you can point to things in scripture, I can look in scripture and I can say, well, we can talk about rivers and floods, but I don't see anywhere outside of places in the book of Revelations and some places in the Old Testament where fire was not necessarily a good thing. I'm going to assume when we get to talking about wildfires out west, that again, we can make some connections throughout the scripture. Um, find those places, get into and read the Bible from an environmental perspective. It will blow your mind. And I am constantly blown away just when I'm looking and I'm reading and highlighting or underlying the places where I see references to not just seed and harvest. And we see that a lot in the New Testament, but in the places of the Old Testament where um, we can read how David and Solomon were instructed to care for trees, that was a very specific thing. As an example, that throughout the Old Testament and in the stories of the children of Israel on their journey, there were a lot of things they could destroy. Trees were not one. And these are things that can speak to us, that we can talk about, I think, that begin to connect us past what is such a vitriolic sometimes conversation around climate, and get back to the heart of what God meant for us to do. I hope that was the answer that you were looking for, because that's the answer that we got today.
That was beautiful. Another question is, some analysts have faulted Christianity for historic failures to include creation care as a moral concern. Is the Black church an exception to this, and can white Christians learn from the Black church in this regard?
Oh, that is such a good and deep question. Let's unpack that a little bit. Um, I don't think that the Black church is an exception, but I do think that we have to take into account the very identity and understanding of the Black church in Christianity, despite the enslavement. That in and of itself is a miracle. That in and of itself is a miracle. And so, this moral conversation, while there is a part of our cultural Christianity that speaks to what we believe is the call to action, I don't think we're the exception to it. We just talk about it sometimes differently. When I think about the responsibility of creation care versus dominionism. So this idea that our role is to take care of God's creation because that's what our responsibility is. That's our assignment here as humanity versus just telling it what to do. And, it is being in dominion over, as is described in Genesis. I think there's a way that the Black church looks at that because of the close identity that we have with freedom, how we came to freedom, um, the role that God has played in that freedom, despite what in some places the role that the church had in continuing the enslavement, but the resiliency there um, has given us responsibility to care for, not to do the same thing that was done to us, but to be the body of Christ and to be what Jesus was. And I think that really speaks to people within the Black church in a very cultural way that it's hard to find in other places. Um, but it doesn't mean that it's the exception by any stretch of the imagination because there's still challenges. I mean, there's still right now today, I think in all of the church and the faith-based community, we've seen a decline in people who readily identify themselves with any any denomination within the Christian faith, despite whether or not they've had some connection to it through family or through community. The ability to ask questions, to question and to have dialogue and to think through what does this mean for us has to take into account the history and the history that both um, the church played during the period of enslavement, good and bad, as well as the mantle that we took on when we became and accepted this faith as a part of our culture.
Thank you. That was a really deep and compelling answer. I appreciate that a lot. I wanted to lift something up that that came out of something you said earlier and then something you said at the answer to your last question. And it's around somewhere around relationship to land. You talked about being connected to the land, and the example that you gave about talking to relatives up north. They got a lot of snow, so you knew the river was going to come up. And then you just talked about people noticing that the seasons are changing and, wondering about snakes in the hunting, which that's not my area, but I'm getting the that sort of sense of a connection with what's going on. And one of the things that we talk about, at least in the creation care groups that I meet with, is that there is a relationship between a disconnect from the land, a disconnect from creation, and people's either participation in or complicity with harming creation and harming other people incidentally by that. I guess my two-part question is, do you think there's any truth to that? And if so, how do we begin to combat that? And does the church have a role in helping build a relationship with creation?
Absolutely. So yes, there is a direct connection, and some of it is institutionalized, and we have to deal with that. There's been an intentional separation of community and from people from just the immediate access to land. Think about the high-rise housing projects in the 70s. What you saw being put up in Chicago and in the industrialization after we had so many people that were leaving in the Great Migration that left the Southeast. And, those from Mississippi went to Chicago, those from Alabama went to Detroit, and you could just follow the train lines going up. The places in which people were housed, it was a disconnect from the land so that there was a focus on the industrialization and the jobs that they had to do. So people went from being in these nice, free, open spaces while it was under very, very difficult conditions. There was a disconnect. Someone who is in a hot church in the middle of a field on a Sunday still knows what it means when you say Psalms 23. And when you say, you create the imagery of lying in a meadow or a stream or a brook. But a child who's in Chicago, who's living in a 14-story high rise with bars on the window and has a concrete all around them, has no concept in the same way that that person who lived in that experience would. So when we talk about it from a biblical perspective, they could be in the same type of church, but they don't have the same type of imagery and the same type of connection. And that disconnection does take us away from understanding from a spiritual perspective what was being described and the value of what was being described, but also the physical impact. And this is a combination, in my opinion, of both the spiritual and the physical. We know that it's important for us to have vitamin D. We know that the sun gives us energy, and it's something that's invigorating that we're told that we need. And but we're also told that we have to protect from it. But if we get depressed, we're told that we need to go outside. But if we read scripture, we see all these variations of how it can be used. But without that on-site, on-time, regular connection, yes, it can become something that is dismissed and is abused. It's how we discover why areas and waterways are so polluted. Well, if there's no care and understanding of that connection of the water source as a place that feeds you, you get fish from, as a place that cleans you, whether or not you are using the water in your household or you are being baptized on the lakeside. If you're not connecting with that, then the value of it is diminished. I think the second part of your question was, what is the role of the church in being able to connect to that? And I think it's in providing and showing those spaces of value, showing how these are things that we need to protect, but that there is a value spiritually, physically, economically, and that these are things that we have to pull together because that is caring for creation. That is our assignment. There is a verse, forgive me, I do not recall it exactly. I just know it's in the book of Romans that says that all of creation, it cries out and it yearns for us. And I think it's the responsibility of the church for us to express that. Creation is calling out and yearning for humanity to take its role in protecting creation. We have a problem when the rocks are crying out for us, quite literally, because that indicates we haven't been doing our job. And I think that's where the church needs to have and really step up its role of being that caretaker of creation and teaching people how to do that.
Thank you. Do you, this was a question in the Q&A that I wanted to lift up. Do you have, and this could be church or community focused, a success story, something that you've seen work very well, that we can point toward as something to take example from, somewhere we can learn from, if we're just getting started in this work?
Yeah, I love that. So thank you for that. I love all of the organizations that are along the South Louisiana corridor, first because their work is so hard and they're so resilient. But whether it's Rise St. James or Descendants Project or Communities of St. John, those parishes, they're all faith-based. Every single one of them, they're faith-based environmental justice organizations. Research and look up Miss Sharon. I was about to call her doctor. I'm going to give her a doctorate. She needs one. But Sharon Levine and Rise St. James, whose very mission, it is the David and Goliath story. It is a exercise of her faith of this is what God has told me to do. And the entire organization and pull of the church is geared towards that. It is, I think, profound when we look at people that we would have dismissed as not having the expertise or the resources to be able to fight against huge facilities that seem insurmountable. Yet, for folks of faith, that's the entire basis of what we believe. It is that God uses the foolish things to confound the wise, quite literally. And we are the smallest at that. So why not? And why not that not be the case? Green to Church is another. I love Reverend Ambrose out of California and Texas. They're doing amazing work. Another great example, while it's not completely faith-based, I would think this is like a community example, the Regenesis Project in Spartanburg, South Carolina. Another wonderful way that a community came together, used a very, very small EPA grant that was really for um, workforce development. They had an overburdened population of toxic chemicals and brownfields, and were looking at a way that they could revitalize the community. And what they decided to do was just to teach people how to put together solar panels and for housing. And they leveraged that and turned that into changing the way that their housing was set up to single family dwellings versus being sort of stacked, what we talked about earlier. And that's been leveraged into now more than $30 million um, uh, impact to that particular community. Another good example is Harambe House in Savannah, Georgia. Dr. Mildred McLean, again, doing that same model of taking and training and teaching people a tool, a skill that has to do with sustainability, and really shifting the focus from a we need to be cared for to more of an internal, I'm a part of this community and a part of this process, and this is now encompassing all that I do, including my economic stability.
Thank you. There's so many good examples there. It's really, it's actually very encouraging to hear all of these organizations who are having success doing exactly what you've written about. You wrote a lot in the book about food justice. So there was a question in the Q&A about bottled water specifically, and about, the expectation that we not use bottled water, and the challenge of that request in a number of communities. So I wanted to lift up that question and ask you to speak a little bit more about that, maybe in the larger context of food justice, and how we can all work on food justice with reasonable expectations about what people are able to do based on where they live and what's available to them.
Yeah, that's a tough one, because I titled it as a part of the think EBT cards. I think of the EPT, environmental poverty tax, that's placed upon folks who are forced to use bottled water. So when we think about Flint, Michigan, where the water system in and of itself failed the people of the community, and they were forced to use this, and not too far from me here in Mississippi, in Jackson, Mississippi, where the entire water system failed, and as a result of that failure, people were forced to use bottled water. But we don't take into account the tax that puts on people from a financial perspective, and from a city perspective or a municipal waste perspective. The amount of microplastics that are going into the body simply from you drinking bottled water is a cost to health. But also, when you have some type of tragedy like what happened in Jackson, Mississippi, we saw tractor trailer truckloads of water coming into a space that desperately needed. But ask yourself, how long does it take to fill up a bathtub when you are filling it up with 12-ounce bottles of water? Could there not be another way that we are getting these items to people? And what happens to it? Because what the next thing people will say is, you need to recycle that. How? Where? Who collects it? What do they do with it? Is the city actually paid for it? And then when we really think about what is the outcome of recycled plastic bottles, it's actually the burning of those plastic bottles to attempt to make something else, which puts more toxic chemicals into the air. Why don't we just save the time and the money by fixing the water system in the first place, and making sure that people have access to clean water, getting our reuse in spaces? And I know there was a whole lot going on around everybody, the Stanley Cup phase. Everybody had a Stanley Cup. If you were on social media or are on social media, like the reuse of having a particular kind of cup. And while I'm definitely not an advocate for any name brand, I do think it's important for us to use these moments to connect what is sustainability and how do we use that in a way that actually helps overburdened populations that are really dealing with the crux of the problem. Um, the last thing I'll say on that is, usually it's the folks who don't have access to clean water who have to go out and buy the bottled water, who are also dealing with the additional impacts in the community. So if you're living right underneath of these polluting facilities, you might have eczema more than folks do in other places, which means you're going to need a special soap or you need a special lotion. And when you go to your local Walgreens or CVS, it's typically more expensive, that you got to get something special to use if you are using that water. And on top of that, in these communities, these are not common places that are available. So either you got to drive to get there and use your gas money, or find to figure out a way to get to something that you need, or deal with the health impacts that you have from having that. These are the kinds of calculated costs that I think go into what I think of as an environmental poverty tax, when you're forced to use something that other people in this country are able to access freely and at a reduced cost.
So if you are somebody like me, I live in, random nondescript suburb of Columbus, Ohio, and one of the benefits of that is that I don't worry about the quality of the water that comes out of my tap, although I know that there are people in the Columbus area that do have those concerns. How does somebody like me begin to affect change, like just on that, let's say on that issue specifically?
I look right around, start at home first. As we say, charity begins at home. I would look closest to you in your community to see and identify if there are pathways and groups and spaces that don't have access, that don't have the very same things that maybe the tax dollars are paying for in one space versus the other. And look, everybody should have access to what is coming out of your city municipal system, because they're required to let folks know the status of the water. And so start there. Um, and ask questions of accessibility, of safety, to see if there are any concerns that have taken place, and then branch out from those spaces. I'd also say altruism is profound within our country, but we don't really share and know that. And that is, even the cost of communities that are in a space where they don't have to think about these things, are likely to not be. Let me go back. There is a study that was done by EPIC, the Energy Policy Institute in Chicago, that showed that people are likely to even be willing to pay a little bit more if it means that the circle is broadened of safety, whether that's energy, reliability, water safety. People would willingly pay 50 cents or $1 more if it meant that the larger community had access to safe water or reliable energy. And I think we just have to say that to one another, share these stories, and really talk about it so that the larger community does not feel ignored and does not feel like they're out there by themselves.
I love that you started with essentially saying educate yourself. I know for me, we shared a little bit earlier, there was so much in your book that really caused me to take pause and step away from the assumptions that that I have about the way that we live, and really be interested in the truth of what's out there. And once you know the truth, I think our faith really compels us to do something about it. It's easier to not know sometimes.
Yeah.
But but once it's like you can't really look away. And I don't know where the hour went. I honestly don't. But I really would like to invite you in closing to share anything that you have not had a chance to say that you just really, for lack of a better term, would really just like for the group who's listening tonight to hear about your book, about environmental injustice as a whole, really anything. The floor is yours.
I appreciate it. And I really am truly grateful. I'm grateful for the audience. I'm grateful for the platform and grateful for these conversations to continue to go. You have no idea how it does my heart good to know that the discussion is happening and that we're talking to one another. I shared before, I come from a family of faith. I cannot separate my faith from my work. And so, um, whether it's liked or not, I always talk about it, but I feel compelled to always share that there is hope. And if there is any group of people that is going to be impactful in solutions, it's communities of faith. It is communities of faith because that is the essence of who we are, what we believe, and we wouldn't be who we are if we did not have those elements of faith. Right now at our church, we're reading through the book of Mark for Lent. And the thing that has stood out to me through this moment of reflection and reading and studying is the number of times that Jesus really elevated those that people really didn't think about the most. Whether it was the man being healed from evil spirits, or if it was somebody being reaching out and touching, or him going and finding and seeing and calling people, it was always the least of those, the folks that seemed to be on the outskirts of society and that were ignored by religion and by politics. Those were the people that were the recipients of grace. And for me, as I think about environment and think about what we can do, I think it is incumbent upon the church to reach those that others have forgotten, to look to the overburdened populations and communities, to use our skill sets of hope and belief and instill that so that people know together there is a solution and we can find it. But it will take us returning to those things that call us to truly care for humanity, to care for creation, and to follow the one commandment that we have, which is to love one another. As we do that, then I think solutions will begin to really reveal themselves.
Thank you. That is a hopeful and uplifting note to end on. Heather, thank you. Heather McTeer Toney is the author. I'll say the name of the book again. You can see it over her shoulder. Before the Streetlights Come On, Black America's Urgent Call for Climate Solutions, a compelling read. The recording of this conversation will be on her website, heathermcteertoney.com. It will be posted out there. Feel free to share
It's
it.
going to take us a few days to get up, so just be patient with us.
Go to the website in a few days. Don't go tonight. We are so grateful for your time and your wisdom and your commitment to this cause and sharing your knowledge with us, people who are just really hoping to help and engage.
Thank you all. And I didn't share, but please do make sure you follow all of our social media stuff. You can find it on the website and put in all the great book reviews. All of this is wonderful, and I am forever grateful.
Wonderful. I think you've gained a number of new fans tonight, so we are grateful. Thank you. Thank you, Heather. And thank you, everybody, for attending. Have a wonderful evening. We'll see you on the 13th in Cincinnati.